of the History and Political Science Department that sponsors the Keim Lecture. I just wanted to note that the Keim Lecture is named for Al Keim, who I replaced coming in here, very large shoes to fill. He was a long time and much beloved professor here. He was raised Amish Mennonite in Ohio, then went and did PAC service, and I just learned listening to Kathy Fisher, his wife, and talking with Troy, that actually the community that Al helped work in and rebuild during his PAC's time in the early 1950s is the same community Troy actually did interminnow in much later on. So there's a nice connection there. Al passed away in 2008, and we set up this lecture series in his honor. We began it in 2013. They've had many wonderful speakers over the years. We're very happy this year to have with us Dr. Troy Osborne. Troy is coming to us from Conrad Grebel University, where he is the Dean and Associate Professor of History and Theology. He also teaches courses in Reformation and Mennonite history. I think most of you are aware of him, if you're aware of him, because with the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism this year, his book that just came out, Radicals and Reformers, A Survey of Global Anabaptist History, which we have an image of but neglected to get copies of here to sell you. I'm sorry about that. Just came out last year and has been really a wonderful new text for learning about Anabaptist history and putting it into a global perspective. Troy was here with us today, did our chapel this morning, and is with us here for the Keim Lecture. He'll be talking with our Mennonite history class tomorrow, so we're really happy to have him here on campus. On a personal note, I'm very happy to have him here. Troy and I grew up in Heston, Kansas together, and we're longtime friends, so I'm very happy to welcome him back in that capacity as well. So the talk today is called Beyond Radicals, Reformers, and Martyrs, the Possibilities and Perils of a Usable Past. Troy, welcome.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. It's really great to see you. I've been warmly welcomed here and hosted here, and I've done a lot of talking already today. So I'm slightly concerned my voice may give out before the end of this, but well, I will do my best. This is the first time I've been to Harrisonburg. I have worked and studied at most other Mennonite colleges and seminaries in the U.S. And my president said, don't start working at EMU just to complete the set. And so we'll see what happens here. So this book came out. It was commissioned by the book there. The book there was commissioned by Herald Press. There was a suggestion. Mary takes credit for suggesting the book, so I thank her for it, but also during the middle of writing it, I could have shaken my fist at her. But it was commissioned by Herald Press to offer a new, is this on? Yeah, okay. I see concerned look from the soundman up there. All right, to a new usable book for the use at colleges and seminary levels, and that was the mandate that I had. The other mandate, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is it's supposed to be global in nature. So those were the two kind of strictures that I had. And the hope was that it would come out in time to celebrate or commemorate the 500th anniversary of the first Anabaptisms in Zurich, Switzerland in January 1525. I cut that deadline close. It took me about, when I was a little embarrassed to go back and see how long it took me to write the book from when they asked me, and it was over a decade. But I'll blame COVID and learning the history of lots of new countries and things like that. But it did come out in time, and it's been an exciting year to commemorate this beginnings 5 centuries ago. What I'd like to do for you this morning is talk a little bit about the book and what went into it, my approach to writing it. But then as the sort of the last part of the second half of this morning, or this afternoon, I'd like to think about the project in general and this idea of writing history, telling our history, and how do we as Mennonites and how do we as Christians, why do we use the past? Why do we use history to reflect about our own identity? I was looking over my notes today, and towards the end it gets a little sermonizing. I hope not. It's a little, like for a historian, I'm realizing, what am I doing here, right? We shouldn't be getting into theology. We should just be telling the past. So just at the end here, with a little call for how we might use Christian history going forward. I want to also just take a time here to say that I'm thankful for students at EMU who read at least this. Mary used drafts of this at least once in a class, maybe more than once, and their feedback was really helpful. So in some way, your students were also part of this over the last decade at certain points. Okay. Let's see. So that's, I should have started there. That is, when the book was created, the Herald Press or Menno Media decided, they offered to do it, and they suggested they were going to offer me a team of editors or a review council to offer me feedback as we went on. You know, when you're an author or when you write, music, you have voices in your head that you're always kind of in dialogue with, and I can tell you literally who the voices in my head were because they, I just hit a button here. They gave me feedback the whole way. So Jamie Pitts from Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, Carl Koop from Canadian Mennonite University, Mark Jansen from Bethel College in Kansas, John Roth from Goshen, this is Amy Gingrich, the editor-in-chief, Marlene Epp, my colleague at Grebel, Gerald Mast at Bluffton, and Mary here at EMU. And what I appreciate, I also had Felipe Hinojosa from Baylor, and there was a gentleman whose name slips me right now, Showalter, I think, from Rosedale in Ohio. So lots of people giving me feedback on the process. And I really appreciate that because I'm not going to blame them for any mistakes in the book, but it was meant to be usable, and it was meant to be accessible to their students, because all of us had taught Anabaptist or Mennonite history, and all of us were teaching it in the classroom. Herald Press, they don't want to use the term replacing C.J. Dick's book, An Introduction to Mennonite History, but there was time to replace that book, which wasn't quite as accessible to what our students needed in the class. It was originally printed in the 1960s, and there were 3 different editions of it. The last was in the 1990s, and it was felt there was a time to freshen it up a bit. So this is not seen as a superior. I don't ever say this is better than CJ's books for these reasons, but it's a book hopefully for a new generation at a new time. I discovered after I started writing my book that CJ actually didn't write that whole book himself. It was actually written by a variety of authors, and he edited it. So one of the things that is unique about this book is that it is, I think, the first sole-authored Mennonite history book since maybe C. Henry Smith's book in the 1920s. We can talk about that later. Okay. So as I set out to think about writing this book and to figure out what my approach would be, I did a little research in sort of the different ways that other congregations or other Christian communities have written their histories. There's been some excellent histories of the Catholic Church that have come out in the recent years, of Catholicism for a global perspective, Lutheranism from a global perspective. And so I looked at some of those to how they approached this topic. Right? It becomes very difficult to talk about a church that is 500 years old on multiple continents and multiple different variations of it. So how do you write a usable narrative out of that without just making it an encyclopedia that lists everybody out there? Pre-20th century, church history could probably be called ecclesiastical history. The subject were things like bishops, religious law, church councils, liturgy, politics of international religion, and diplomacy, and basically official theology. Right? It's sort of the history of the church institutions itself. And it's not even clear to me what that kind of approach would have meant for the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition, because we don't have much of that. Right? We're decentralized. We didn't produce systematic theologies for ages. We have some confessions of faith, but to sort of say that here's how the official Mennonite positions changed over time, that wouldn't have really been a helpful approach. And my own training and my own background is to use what's called maybe the history of religion rather than the history of Christianity. And it's been an approach that has changed the way we write this history markedly. It's away from the center of the faith to the locality. Religious activities in local communities is what we're looking at. So as one scholar said, it's the religious history of individual Christians, and the local church is just a legitimate topic as the theologies of the leaders of the denomination. Nothing against leaders, there are some in this room, but it's not the only thing that these books can discuss. So it's an anthropological approach, widening the definition of religious behavior. So if you're looking at the pre-Christian church, it would be rites and practices that official histories of the church would have considered pagan histories. And in the current era, it gives greater attention to the interaction between Christians and non-Christians, even in the early modern world, which is my specialty. And now it's trying to take to explain and understand the numerical dominance of the churches in Africa, Asia, and Latin America over the European and Southwest Asia or the Middle East, which had been the traditional hearths of Christianity. So it's a view from below. Well, I kind of mix that with some of the official changes as well. And just the other thing that sort of a survey of who's writing church history or religious history says that the people who are writing it are a little different as well. My training was one where you would sort of tamp down your own religious conviction, your own religious commitment to the tradition you were writing about. There's a case that the head of the Catholic Historical Association was a Jewish scholar. Right, that wouldn't have been unthought of, and the idea was that you try to present not objective, but you try to represent an unbiased opinion of what you're writing about. And I declared my allegiance at the beginning of the book, but I hope I still presented it in a way that represented people fairly. But generally, in my field of church history, there's a commitment of scholars to conceal belief stances so thoroughly that readers find it difficult to discern what the author believes. Right? Is this person even a Christian? They're right. I can't tell by the way they're writing about it. And we're trained, I think that's a good thing sometimes, that you actually can't tell their religious conviction themselves. So I took on the challenge of writing the book because it felt like there was a need for the university level classroom. I teach at a secular university, even though I teach at a Mennonite college, and many of my students have very little understanding of Christian context, right? So, what? Jesus is God? Wait, hold on, right? Wait, who is Mary again? Those kinds of questions. And so you can't teach the class from any kind of assumption that students come with an understanding of what's going on. I will say something about, let me see if I can go back. The title, I should note here. One thing I discovered as an author is you don't get to choose your titles. Because I would push back at the idea that the only type of Anabaptist worth writing about are the radicals and the reformers. They maybe were radical in the beginning, which is kind of the golden age that we look at, and that's what we celebrate. I did that in chapel this morning. I celebrated the courage and the hope. But it's not necessarily the entire story, right? The story is that at some point they chose to survive. And they chose to, compromise isn't the right word, but they chose to acclimate, acculturate, assimilate, right? As the historian said, the historian, recently deceased historian James Stayer said, it's like Pauline Christianity or rabbinical Judaism confronted with the overwhelming power of Rome. These people chose life over death. And partly because they chose life, their progeny had a marked influence on the history of Britain and North America from the century following the Reformation. Stayer's talking about the Anabaptists there. He says, at some point, the radical movement, there's a declension, and they chose to survive rather than just being the radicals. So I don't want to dismiss the radicalness of what they did, but that does not capture 500 years of Anabaptist history. Right? There are moments of radicalness throughout the time when people from all the continents choose to join the church, choose to make a decision to leave the church at their beginning, but that's not the whole story. It's less glamorous of a story that way, but it's not the whole story. The teacher in me wants to always stop for questions, but I'm not going to do that. We can ask questions at the end. So I had 4 commitments that I used when I wrote this book, and I'll just go through here. One is this, as I mentioned earlier, is the focus on a lived experience. Again, I made this PowerPoint on my little computer, and that text was a lot bigger on it, so I apologize for that. But I emphasize how Anabaptists lived out their faith in changing times and places. So I don't really do a lot with doctrine or attempt to distill essential Anabaptist teachings. I am interested in how faith is lived out, and that's the approach I took from my dissertation. What difference did it actually make in people's lives? That's the question I find interesting. Sorry, theologians out there. Pete Doolin, I see. Confessions of faith and official theology are helpful ways to summarize shared convictions, but they may not always be internalized at the level of the laity. And the example I often give is my maternal grandparents, who faithfully read from the daily guideposts, and my paternal grandparents, my dad's parents, read Sunday school materials published by Herald Press every morning before breakfast. Both grandparents, though, were planted Mennonite churches in Indiana and Michigan. And yet, as far as I know, none of them ever read the Anabaptist vision, H.S. Bender's portrait of 16th century Anabaptism that shaped, we tell as historians, we say this is the document that shaped Mennonite identity in the 20th and 21st century, but my grandparents never read it, and they planted churches and considered themselves Mennonites to the core. So by looking at the stories of the person in the pew, Anabaptist history becomes much more dynamic and then focusing only on official theological essentials. And I think there's a lot more work to be done in this. There's a lot of interesting work done on evangelicals and the things they buy. The book Jesus and John Wayne is an example of that. So there could be more to be done with this with Anabaptists. I did also want to emphasize 500 years of Mennonite history. I talk about how they transitioned from radical reformers into settled and established churches. There was a lot of heated discussion in that group that was giving me advice because some people really wanted to move quickly from the 16th century to the exciting global situation that we find ourselves in now. Right? They did not want a lot of coverage of the period from about 1600 to about 1900. I don't critique them for that, but they just felt like this is where the growing edge of the church is. This is the story we need to tell. But I and others in my group had a chronological commitment to including those intermediary years because that's the story of how the Mennonites, Amish, Hutterites figured out how to enact their beliefs in different contexts, different political cultures, different languages, etc. This chronological commitment also means including honest accounts of when Anabaptists fell short of their own ideals or when they act in ways that, looking from the perspective of the 21st century, readers find unacceptable. So it could be from apocalyptic kingdoms to conforming uncritically to the world around them. Anabaptists have been all too fallible at times, but they have been creative and integrating new spiritual streams like pietism, which thoroughly spread across many Anabaptist groups, renewing their spiritual life for centuries. And the historian Steve Nolt has said that it's impossible anymore to figure out what in Mennonite thought is Anabaptist and what's pietist. It's baked in there to the core. The other commitment was a global history. Over the past half century, Anabaptists has transformed from a movement of 600,000 Europeans and North Americans into a global movement of 2.2 million members, mostly living in Africa and Asia. And the history of those churches can be seen in the volumes of the Global Mennonite History Series, which many of you may be familiar with. And I was so grateful to have history written by local authors. So those authors are supposed to come from the countries that they wrote about. I was really glad to be able to write about them. This history, the history of the creative ways that the gospel is shared in new context, learning that and telling that story was one of the most personally rewarding aspects of working on the project. And I should say that I quoted the president of the Ethiopian Mennonite Church, Meseretes Christos Church, who is in the audience today, unplanned. There he is back there. So I have a nice quote for him at the end of the chapter on Africa, if you want to see what he looks like. There he is, back there. Thank you for being here today. Finally, just again to say that this is supposed to be a text for all readers. The driving force behind this book is to develop a text for use in classrooms. So in my classes at Bluffton University and Conrad Grebel University College, students were curious and eager to learn, didn't always have a lot of background in the topic, or they didn't necessarily hold religious commitments. So it has to be told in an invitational way to readers from a variety of backgrounds. So this is why this panel of historians was really helpful for me in figuring out that process. So I always feel kind of weird when people say, oh, I've been reading your book at home. Because that's like, why would you read a textbook at home by your bed? And it's a very strange idea to me that I always feel like I have to apologize for. I have a lot of, I don't know, it's very hard for me to sort of say that, oh, good choice, thanks for buying it. It's more like, sorry about that. I hope you enjoyed your naps. Okay, so that's the commitment I had when I wrote the book, and I was held to those commitments by my colleagues, that group of readers. So that's the approach and the historiographical approach that I took. And now we get to the question that is going to be, who's going to be in this book? What is an Anabaptist, and what is Anabaptism? You'd hope I would know that question before I started writing the book. But it's a question that you have to ask yourself continually. Who gets included in this story, and how do we talk about it? I think it's actually easier to identify that first question, who is an Anabaptist, than the second, what is Anabaptism? I think pinning down what Anabaptism is very difficult. They are a related question, though. Here you can see from its beginning, Anabaptists didn't quite know what they said. This is in case you can't read it, it's a quote from Erasmus. It says, "I feel sorry for the Anabaptists. They could be helped if baptism were the only issue, but they introduce confusion into everything. They're possessed by a kind of madness. But yet I'm told that some members of this sect are not all evil people." So I think it still holds true today. So the question of who is or is not may seem like a straightforward question, but it's like if you had a drop of water that you called Anabaptism, and then you looked at it under a microscope, and you saw all the protozoa and all the amoebas in it, and you just realized, oh, there's much more going underneath the surface here than I am aware of. And it's much more difficult then to accurately say what's inside that drop of water. And so I often feel like everywhere I go, I'm invited to talk about the book. I have to apologize that maybe there wasn't enough about your local community there or your local church branch. It's hard to be exhaustive in doing it. So just a reminder of 2 attempts, though, to summarize the visions of it. And this is not the attempt I took. The famous Anabaptist vision I talked about earlier was written by H.S. Bender. Oh, I should do a test if you have it memorized and see if you do it, but maybe you don't. Anabaptist Christianity as discipleship, a new conception of the church as brotherhood, and a new ethic of love and of non-resistance. That, to Bender, that was the core Anabaptist teaching. When people veered from that, it was an aberration or a distortion or a mutation. That was the way he told that story. This is a vision that's a powerful vision. I can still be inspired by reading Bender's work today. So I'm not saying, oh, we have to throw it out. I think there's great teaching potential in these sorts of summaries. A more recent encapsulation is written by Palmer Becker, goes to my church. Again, he says, Jesus is the center of our faith, community is the center of our life, and reconciliation is the center of our work. I know this book is really helpful for global Mennonites to understand kind of what is Anabaptism. Is this familiar here at all? Okay, all right. I am less convinced that it's easy to find a core to Anabaptist, much less a core of Christianities. There's no such thing as an unadulterated Christianity. All forms of the church are imperfect until the end times. And yet, I don't even know if you can sort of differentiate when did the adaptions go far, because Mennonites today are in some ways totally unrecognizable from who they were a while ago. But that's why you tell 500 years, is because you want to track the change and you want to track the changes over time. So my criteria is that if somebody thought they were part of the group, I included them. But that doesn't solve the problem, because sometimes there are cases where commitment to even these kind of core teachings is very tenuous in some groups who call themselves Mennonites or Anabaptist. And I think that when you accept everybody who has Mennonite in their name and they're not following the teachings, it becomes more of an ethnic signifier than a faith signifier. And I'm really interested in the faith component, so I didn't include people who would say I'm a Mennonite, but I'm an ethical Mennonite, not really a religious Mennonite. I really wanted to look at people who were parts of Mennonite churches or communities. There are also lots of other groups who may not even think of themselves as part of the movement, but I include them. You could think about the groups like the Amish, the Low German Mennonites, who we have a lot of, who are coming up from Mexico into southern Ontario. They may not care at all about this and may not think of themselves as part of the same movement, but I include them as part of it. I just made that strong editorial decision that they were going to be included. The approach I kind of took is that Anabaptists and Mennonites tell a story about who they are. And that story changes over time. And this common identity and a shared history is a type of fiction, but it's a powerful fiction that can call others to act. And so I don't use fiction here in a pejorative sense, right? But it's a story that people tell that unites them together, that makes them work together towards a common end. And I think the story I see starts really in 1615 with the first martyrology that talks about Dutch martyrs, Swiss martyrs, and South German martyrs together, put together by the Dutch leader Hans de Vries. He sent out researchers across Europe. They gathered these sources, put it together. Previous Dutch martyrologies had focused, it went from Stephen to the Dutch. That was the chronology they had. But now he was making a bigger story that everybody who died for adult baptism and defenselessness, they were all part of the same movement together. And that was his argument that he made. This was expanded into the more familiar so-called Martyr's Mirror, written in 1660 by Tieleman van Bracht. I say so-called because he called it the Bloody Theater of Defenseless Christians, and Martyr Mirror was added to the more famous later reprint. But then there are other examples as well where the story continues to have power. So I'm just going to give you a couple examples. There's a collection of letters to the Mennonite community in Upper Canada, that's modern-day Ontario. I'll read a little bit of one letter here. This is from a preacher in Herrenhagen, West Prussia, which is modern-day Poland, to Benjamin Eby, bishop in Berlin. That's Isebrand Wiebe to Benjamin Eby. You have a Prussian Dutch Mennonite to a Swiss Mennonite in southern Ontario. My beloved brother, in body we are far from each other, but through the blood of Jesus we are always close in spirit. Even if we cannot see our faces here in the transitoriness, nevertheless love will urge us to pray to God, the Father of all, for each other. And it's a remarkable little unknown collection of letters where these early 19th century leaders are reaching out for contact to each other. So they have shared and they understand themselves to be part of the same story. It's continued in the 19th century when John F. Funk and the Herald of Truth reporting on the Mennonite migration from Ukraine to the United States and Canada. And Funk, in addition to being a pioneer Mennonite publisher, plays a major role in helping the immigration and colonization of Russian Mennonites into the US and Canada. And in fact, Funk became essentially the publisher for Manitoba Mennonites. So they're not part of the same tradition, but Funk makes a case. There's a famous book that collects his articles called Brothers in Deed to Brothers in Need, or vice versa there. And he's making the case that these are our brethren and sisters. We should help them. So despite significant differences in practice, language, and even theology, they are telling each other the story of a common connection with each other. And so I will say that as long as people are telling that story, and as long as they're holding it to be true, I tell that story as well. This is not about a golden age that we have to recapture, but figuring out how they've lived out transitions in time and space to new contexts. So I look at the theme of, I use the theme of renewal. And these are just some of the renewals. I make arguments that all of these are types of renewal movements. And I'll just touch on them very briefly. You can, if you can read the book if you want, but telling the martyr stories is a renewal movement, right? They want to encourage acculturated, very wealthy Dutch Mennonites to remember the faith of the people who came before them. The Amish division is a renewal movement where Jacob Ammon travels to Switzerland and he says, you've lost the glory, you've lost that fire, you need to hold on to the divisions. Pietism, it's a 17th, 18th century renewal movement that looks to create a warm relationship of Christ in your heart. It's bigger than just Mennonites, it's Lutherans and Calvinists. And the Dutch call it the Second Reformation, or the Further Reformation, but it's really moving away from a dry academic faith to a faith that is internal and warm and pietistic, is where we get the phrase. The Enlightenment, this is one of my own suggestions, is in the Dutch Mennonites, that's a type of renewal movement. They look for ways to improve the lives of their fellow Dutchmen and women. Mission and Sunday school movement is definitely in the 19th century renewal movement. My Quaker Osborne ancestors joined the Mennonite church in Kokomo, Indiana, because it was the only one with Sunday school, and that's what got them into it. So there you go. The Anabaptist vision, which I mentioned earlier, and then in the 20th century, Mennonite collaboration and conversations with what we now call evangelicalism, fundamentalism. Before that, also works as a type of renewal movement. One of the stories that you read again and again are people writing letters. Oh, the youth these days, they're upset with how we do it. They see us as a dry tradition. We need to come back with something to get them excited in the church again. So it's not a current problem. It happens throughout the Mennonite story and Mennonite history. I also, as I said, there's a different kind. I looked for other kinds of themes, and I found some themes in the global story as well. And it becomes much more complicated to talk about origins when you tell the global story. Because in many cases, the origins actually start without any Mennonite or Anabaptist involvement, and then the groups look for churches where they can find a home and they find the Mennonite story or the Anabaptist story, and they ask to join. I had a South Korean student in my class, and he made very sure that he was an Anabaptist and not a Mennonite, because he said, we had nothing to do with the Mennonites, but they are committed Anabaptists. On the screen there, you see Si Jun Nyo and T. Siem Tat. His story is a famous story. Dr. Tat was ill one day. He became very sick. And he had a vision of seeing Jesus, and he was healed. And when he woke up, he went to the market and released all the birds, because he felt that was how free Christ had made him. And that is the origin of the Chinese Indonesian church, right? There's no Mennonite involvement at all, but they go out and then they make some Mennonite as well. So origins gets very complicated when you tell the global stories. But there are some common themes too. And difficult transition, it's a euphemistic way to talk about the disruption of when the missionaries left the mission field. In Africa, this was often a case because they were forced to leave, but the same thing in India. And there's lots of stories about the people they left behind not feeling like they had been properly prepared to be autonomous and take control of their own churches. So lots of different stories of that. And then another common thing is that you find in more recent conversations among the global church is, they're re-questioning what the missionaries told them about venerating their ancestors. They had all been told by the missionaries, this is from China to Africa to Indonesia, you can no longer venerate your ancestors. And now there's a process where many of them are reconsidering that and saying, well, do we have to give all that up? And maybe there's parts of it we can retain and still be authentically Christian. So very interesting work on that happening among the global church. Lots of stories where they're trying to reassess now what's Mennonite, what's cultural, what's theological, what do we keep, what do we leave. A couple of early reviews of the book talked about, Osborne writes, Osborne it's a critique of the Mennonite past, and I hope I did not set out the book to write that way. There are points of the book where I talk about shadow sides of the Mennonite tradition, but it did not set out to be a critical reading of it. So that's something I have to think about when I think about how the book is read by other people. So I also don't want to gloss over some of the shadow sides of the tradition, but it's not meant to be a critical as in critiquing the movement as well. I'll come back to that slide. And the last point here is this, how do we remember the origins of our movement when there has been so much work at reconciliation between especially in Switzerland and in Europe, between the churches that have asked for forgiveness for what happened in the 16th century. How many of you in here saw that service in Zurich or were there in Zurich? Yeah. So if you saw it, it was a remarkable service of reconciliation and saying that the future isn't about us holding the past against each other, but moving forward bravely into the future. The Lutherans asked forgiveness from the Mennonite World Conference in 2010. The Zurich official secular governments have both asked for and received forgiveness in 2017 and a little bit earlier than that. So if they've asked for forgiveness, there is some commitment on our side as Mennonites to tell the story rightly in a way that reflects both sides. So I'll just read Mennonite World Conference's thoughts about this. This is from their statements. We commit ourselves to promote interpretations of the Lutheran Anabaptist story, which takes seriously the jointly described history found in the report that they wrote together. To take care that the initiative for reconciliation is known and honored in Anabaptist Mennonite teachings about Lutherans, and to continue with you deliberation on the unresolved issues between our two traditions, in a spirit of mutual vulnerability and openness to the movement of the Spirit. To encourage our member churches, their local congregations, and their institutions to seek fuller relations and greater cooperations with Lutherans in service to the world. Right? So there has to be, this can't be just the story about the oppressors persecuting the poor Anabaptist, because there's been some work at telling that story correctly. Okay. So why then do we study the past? Right? Part of it is it's interesting, right? It goes from, dang, I hit the wrong button. Okay. Goes from, these are Anabaptists meeting in the woods, there's Taufejäger or Mennonite hunters crashing in and arresting him in the middle, but it's also a story of wealthy, acculturated Dutch Mennonites. and I'd like to ask my students if they can pick the Mennonite out of this picture here by Rembrandt. Mary? Second? Yeah, this is a conservative Mennonite minister here. He was a member of the Cloth Syndic Guilds. So the story has got to include all of these stories of wealth, acculturation, assimilation, and also, oh, I keep hitting the wrong button. So these assimilation things. Okay. So why are we going to study the past? And I'm just going to say this is things I thought about as we prepared in Ontario to celebrate this year of 500th anniversary. There's a sense of unease among some North American and European Anabaptists, first of all, about whether to even celebrate this anniversary. It's unease that comes from celebrating a division in Christianity and because of all the time and energy that has gone into healing the 500-year rifts. Why should we celebrate a division in the body of Christ? Right? And I think you saw some of that concern come out in that worship service. Others caution against the valorizing so now I'm moving to the part of my speech where I think about how we think about history today. I'm going to move away from my book in particular. Why do we just valorize those radicals in the Zurich attic, a story that leads to separatist, non-resistance groups? That's not a helpful story anymore, they say. They suggest that we need to find new stories, marginal stories from the 16th century, like the peasants seeking justice, or artists or authors on the margin of the contemporary world, some who've actually left the Mennonite church. They want a new, usable history that speaks to issues actually facing Christians today. The usable history that they want highlights critique, calls for justice from the beginning of the movement, but it really doesn't want much to do with those intermediate worlds between the radicals and the present. Like, that story is less interesting to them. I've even seen people argue that events from 500 years ago can't speak at all to our contemporary contexts. Instead of looking to heroic beginnings, Mennonites should be focused on the darker side of Mennonite reality, whether it's broken relationship with our indigenous neighbors, collaborations with German authorities in World War II, or conflating racial or ethnic markers for faithfulness. They stress the need, if we're going to use history, let's use it to grip with the past. And you saw there was some of this in the Canadian press, the Canadian Mennonite press, where they said, well, maybe we don't need so much of the past. Let's look to the future and to things that are coming together. So even though in a fifth category I don't know how to categorize, and probably the one that breaks my heart a little, is there are probably a lot of people for whom this event and this year will pass unnoticed, and that history is basically not that important. So we have to acknowledge not everybody cares about it. So, sorry, Mark and Erica. But I teach a theology class where I try to convince my students that it is incumbent on us as Christians to think about the past and to study the past. My friend Alex Sider, who just got installed as president of Bluffton, introduced this book on me, Why Study the Past? And that's had a huge influence. I would recommend it to everybody. It's written by the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and it makes a theological argument for why Christians should study the past. So I'm going to make a case in the remainder today about why we should do it and how Christians should do it. So this is a bit where I'm on my sermon pulpit right now. The great early modern historian Natalie Zeman Davis, who was chased out of the U.S. during the Red Scare of the 1950s, nonetheless a historian of hope. And she says, yes, the past is useful, but I'll read her quote here and then I'll say some more here. But she says, what human beings have done in the past, the enormous range in ways of living and possible actions, is a source of both hope and despair. How fascinating it is to consider this variety in human events. We can draw hope from it in the sense that things have been different in the past. Perhaps we're in a position to make them a little different today. Right? That should give us hope, that we can say there's a contingency in the past that we can make the present better, or at least a little bit different. So when she says usefulness, I don't mean that history offers us models that we can apply. The details of different situations are too unlike each other. History offers us ideas, points of view, perspectives, landmarks, and possibilities. Right? She says that it is helpful for humans to understand the past because you always can be aware that things could have been different, and that should give you hope. It's not about models or the right way to do it. But I also am convinced that Christians have a special obligation to study the past. And I'm not just saying this so that you buy my book. You don't have to buy my book to be with what I'm saying today. But the Christian story, the story of in the Hebrew Bible, is one of God acting in history. From Exodus to Jesus to the early church, God has been working to reconcile humanity to each other and to God. The Israelites, the people of Judah and Israel, Jesus, the early church, and the current church have all taken up that story as our own, right? The story of Christianity is a story of God acting in history. At moments in time, things happened. Rowan Williams has another quote I like. He said, "The Jewish people told stories of great disruptions, exodus, monarchy, exile, and the return. It's not always a coherent picture in the Bible, but it is a narrative, one that includes both failure and displacement." So we tell histories and we tell stories about ourselves, not to define ourselves, change over time. Why are we like who we are? Why are those people different than who we are? If we are modern believers, we are part of a community that stretches across time and space. We have a good sense today that we're part of a community across space, but we don't have a good sense of being part of the saints before us. We see ourselves, because that past is often strange. There's a word that historians have adopted lately about the strangeness of the past, to embrace the fact that the past is actually weird sometimes. People did some strange things, and we don't need to make that feel more comfortable to us or to gloss over it. We should embrace the strangeness of the past. We are different from them, yet we are also a part of them. So we should commemorate with the radical Swiss students and peasants and try to understand how the choices they made at that point have shaped or constrained who we are and how we understand our faith today. But we must resist the temptation to only identify with the parts that make us feel good about ourselves or that we can understand easily. The early Anabaptists also walked naked through the streets of Amsterdam. They tore down crosses. They interrupted sermons and pushed the priest aside. And they celebrated, in the Martyr's Mirror, they celebrated the deaths of those who persecuted them. This, too, is the story of the movement. And I include these stories not to make us feel bad about it because they are true. Right? As a historian and as a Christian, it's important for me to honestly and empathetically to look at and understand a past that can be at times painful as well as something worth commemorating. It is a story of moments of bewilderment. Rowan Williams says the history of the church is, you will find moments of bewilderment and moments of triumphant gasp. There are times you're just saying, what in the world were they thinking? And then moments of sublime beauty as well. And I also then would encourage us then, beyond just this year, to pay attention to the body of Christ across time and space should also mean that we note that the Mennonite story is part of a much larger and longer history and is shaped by the medieval church that came before it. Catholic history is our history. We can see the influence of late medieval mysticism and the religious ideals of the monasticism, as Arnold Snyder describes it. It said this is a monastic spirituality that infuses much of Anabaptism. Looking forward, the story continues across the globe because these stories are our stories. It also informs us what it means to be Anabaptist. We have said this is part of our story. Now we have to theologize what that means. And I'll give you just two stories that I like. Annika Fast is a historian. She's working on a project of African biographies. And two of the stories, just to give you a sense of the richness of this past. She talks about Melengeza Marta, who lived from 1938 to 2021. This is Annika's words. She was a timid yet strong woman who gathered women around her for Bible study and prayer under the impulse of the Holy Spirit until their husbands were drawn in. In this way, she became one of the founders, often overlooked, of a large Mennonite Brethren congregation in Kikwit. Another story that Fast tells is about Sengu Rebecca, an early Congolese Mennonite feminist, midwife, and Bible woman. Sengu insisted on controlling her own earnings. She enrolled in a mission school against her parents' wishes, gave advice to men in conflict, including her husband, told men to give women their place at the home and in the church, and helped found a girls' school, took in vulnerable children. It's an example of women's leadership that gave others courage to follow in her footstep. So the story of origins can also and should also include the stories of African women leading the early African Anabaptist churches. Okay. I think we have a very good sense in North America of what it means to be a church at the congregational level, but what it means to be a part of a larger church is not always clear. We don't have an authority figure like a pope or an official set of beliefs that everyone has to sign on to, and this is something that often surprises and frustrates others who join the church. It feels chaotic. You can always meet people who join Anabaptism, and that moment of when they realize, oh, you all believe anything and you don't agree on anything at all, right? If only they knew. So we need to read the history honestly and humbly. It's not a matter of sifting through the record to find new or better models and examples to support our current convictions. In Ontario, as dean of a college, I have had people appeal to the Anabaptist tradition of counterculturalness to say we should not have a vaccine mandate. The early Anabaptists would never have agreed to it. At the same day, you'd get an email that said, I think the Anabaptist Christian thing to do would to have a vaccine mandate to show love for neighbor, right? People can appeal to the same tradition to end up at different places. So the tradition itself, just like the Bible, doesn't sort things out for you. It's going to be important that we no longer equate the church and faithfulness with a particular set of cultural practices, what kind of food or dress or language we use. But I also want to say that the Anabaptist tradition was nurtured and carried for 500 years by fully clothed Anabaptist practices. The danger in focusing on an ideal, pure, or naked Anabaptism is that people then get disillusioned when they meet the church as it actually exists. Right? As I said, you see this all the time. The church is made up of sinners like me, and it will never be pure or idealized. So our challenge going forward is to think about what's worth keeping and sustaining in our tradition, what needs to be adapted to new contexts. It should not be a rush to quickly cut off any vestige of traditional Mennonite identity, but it should be careful sorting and discernment. It will be important to remain rooted firmly in an understanding of where we have come from, instead of simply leaping from one trend to the other in the hope of becoming relevant. We can't simply transplant the 16th century today, because the current church is not the 16th century in a new context with better health care and government. So we can talk, maybe afterwards, we can talk about what things would you keep from the 16th century. We are people shaped by stories that are shaped by other stories. In a world that prizes innovation and newness, attention to the past has been a practice of resistance for me. I chose to find hope in the past. Natalie Zeman Davis calls herself a historian of hope, and I'd like to end with her words today. We can take heart from the fact that no matter how dire the situation, some will find means to resist, some will find means to cope, and some will remember and tell stories about what happened. So may you find stories of faithfulness, courage, and hope that speak to you today. I forgot to say also, story shaping story, that's not my phrase, that's Willard Swartley, ABS prof there too. That was a good story. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon.
We have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so if you have any, please speak up and we can address those now.
Would you repeat your final statement very slowly?
Sure. The whole, last 3 pages. So this is a quote from it's a different quote than that, but it's a quote from Natalie Zeman Davis. She said, "We can take heart from the fact that no matter how dire the situation, so in the past, some will find means to resist, some will find means to cope, and some will remember and tell stories about what happened." And I said, may you find faithfulness, courage, and hope that speaks to you today. Yes, Pete.
Thanks a lot, Troy. I apologize, I haven't read the book. But one question I have about the writing process is, I imagine as a non-historian that the more theologically driven histories, part of what that does is give the author a sorting mechanism. And for you, with that priority of lived experience, how did you decide what to, as you try to decide what to include or this mass of material?
Can everybody hear the question? It said, when you write a theologically driven book, you can sort who's in and who's out, but when it's lived experience, it's just difficult. Yeah, it is. And I'll be really honest. I put in there how I teach it in class, right? I kind of just knew what I knew, and I put it in there. I tried. Yeah. How did I make that decision? I mean, so this is where that group was helpful. They gave me suggestions about what to include in there, and because so much of what I wrote in the book is not my expertise, I just said if they say it, I'm going to go and write it because I'm a good firstborn child, and I do what my betters tell me to do. But it does get complicated, right? And one of the things that I've just was in Winnipeg last weekend, here for the first time. It was my first time in Winnipeg, my first time here, and it's like I have no idea about the lived experiences really in either of those places to be able to write about them confidently. So I end up writing what I know the best. Lots of Dutch in there. Kansas shows up a lot of Ohio and Indiana. That's just kind of what drove it. So it's not a great answer, but it's what it is. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Most of what, well, not all, much of what you've talked about today is the European and American experiences. And I'm wondering how big a part of the book the world experience beyond Europe.
It's about, I would say, the last third of the book, kind of chronologically. Now, the problem is I wanted to talk about each place and give each place careful consideration. But a lot of that history only happened really in the with the exception of like India, Indonesia, China. Most of that story happens after World War II. And so chronologically, it gets very difficult to give it. You want to give it depth, but it's there's all these years before it. So I'd say the last third of it, roughly. And one thing that the editorial team encouraged me to do would be at the end of each of the first European chapters, North American chapters, is to draw some connections to the global story. To at least say, this is something, people trying to figure out this is something that we saw also in this very specific example in Africa or Asia, to try and make those bridges. Right? As a preeminent historian in Winnipeg told me last week, he said, yeah, I could never do that in a university press. Right? You couldn't put Tulag Woolagung in the same pages as Dirk Willems in a university press. But I can do that in this book. I can say these are some similarities and things like that. So even if it doesn't come to the last third of the book, I try to hint that it's coming up ahead, because that really was one of the goals of the book, is to tell. So this talk today is driven a lot because of the 500th anniversary year we're in, which is a European story, and it's also I assume my audience that's a lot of who they are. I did not expect the president of MKC and the MKC seminary to be here today, but it's a story that my readers are mostly North American students in the classroom. Yeah.
I guess a follow-up question. With Latin America, I guess there's the story of the immigrant Mennonites, and then there's the story of the, I don't know what to say, native Spanish-speaking Mennonites. And how do you tell that?
So I borrow from Jaime Prieto, who wrote the book on the global Mennonite story on Latin America, and he uses the model of mission and migration. Both stories are the Latin American stories. Yeah. So I stole from him, basically. Yeah. Yes, or.
I think all of us know that we Mennonites and Anabaptists are very good at dividing division. How do you represent the divisions within Anabaptism? Is it both lived experience and theology? And how do those two elements of our common life
Yeah.
relationship to our divisions?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Like it is about ideas, but I mean, a lot of the reasons they split is over discipline and lifestyle, right? It's very rarely because we don't have the right Christology. It really has to do with you're not disciplining harsh enough. You're not applying the shun consistently enough, right? Even in the 20th century, there is some theological streams there, but I don't think any of the splits. I would love somebody to tell me if I'm wrong. Is there an Anabaptist split over theology? But there's also, yeah, but I don't think that. I mean, the cynic in me would say those are covering up splits in lifestyle, right? Like it's not really about how you read the Bible; it's what kind of discipleship it results in. Now, one of the things, though, I will say is interesting about that, Mary and I were just talking about today, that in the Dutch Mennonite case, they split lots of times, and people made fun of them for it. But they also worked hard at coming together again. And why they wrote all these confessions of faith. So they did use theology to say, these are the things that we agree. This is going to be the basis of our unity. And those confessions of faith allowed them to come together as one group. So there's a case where theology actually unites more than divides what they did. And that's probably because the lifestyles weren't that different, but it's a very interesting case that a confession of faith actually doesn't lead to a split like it does in North America. It leads to a unity, a moment of unity there. Yeah. Yes.
We're hearing a good bit about reviewing the story, the 16th century story. What kind of thought is being given to creating a story that would be remembered 500 years from now, that Anabaptists in the 21st century experienced the kind of renewal, reboot, rebirth, whatever, that would be memorable in history?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that was the Canadian Mennonite, the magazine for the Canadians. That was kind of their approach, is that we need to think about the future, where we're going for now. And that was my takeaway from Zurich as well, that it's the challenges ahead of us are great, and we need to work together at solving those challenges. I'd ask you what's being done in Harrisonburg about that, but I think it would be different in each community. But I love that question a lot. I think it's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you for the approach that deliberately follows the story of lived religion. And as I filter back through my own memories of being Mennonite or experiencing an awareness of Anabaptism, I'm struck that schools and choirs and singing and relief sales and MDS and MCC may well have mapped whole parts of being Mennonite and being Anabaptist that doesn't really get featured in Anabaptist theology or even particularly church history as such. Do those dimensions of lived experience figure in your narrative?
Yes. Steve Nolt has some great work on this, where he talks about the impact of those people that served in World War II, going out into the world, starting things like MDS, VS, all that stuff, that reshapes what it means, like our understanding of what it means to be, I'm going to say our as an MC USA, MC Canada person here, but that is shaped by those experiences. And he's done this survey of how many people have had international experience at a certain point in time. People my parents' age, number of people that were, I was going to say drafted, they did alternative service in Vietnam, right? He says this is a post-World War II story. So people will talk about the long legacy of Mennonites and Anabaptists and justice. It's like, well, I'm not sure. That's a really recent thing. It doesn't mean it's not true, but it is definitely, that's a story there. So I could tell you some good articles, but Steve Nolt makes a very convincing case about that, how those things have shaped our understanding. I mean, I already told you the answer, but you know the most read Anabaptist book? Here's an extra point. What is it? Yeah, More with Less cookbook, right? And that, I think, that's part of Steve's argument, right? Like that is people reading those stories, that has shaped people's understanding of what it means. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I think about this a lot in my own experience of going to church, right? You got the sermon, you've got Sunday school, but then you also have the potluck. Who's organizing the potlucks? Who are the women, the crew that, you know, in my church it was growing up as women that kick into effect when there's a funeral, right? The sandwiches are ready, they cut all the crusts off, the soup is ready. They're ready to go, right? And that doesn't get in the books as well. If you just want to talk about Anabaptism, unembodied Anabaptism, you lose all the ways, you lose a lot of the work of women before they got education. And the quilting bees, like, you know, you can tell the story, and I think it's in my book, and I know that Kim Schmidt and Mary talk about, you know, the quilting, the sewing circles were the way that faith was spread in the 16th century. And, you know, we had a Dorcas circle in my church that was the sewing circle that they did all that work. And if you did a theology, that wouldn't get anywhere in there. I don't think I talk about Dorcas circles, but yeah. Yes, Andrew.
Thanks so much for this talk. And let me just say it is a pleasure to read your book. keen to hear more about that because MWC was very, I think,
Yeah.
has been very cautious about not talking about celebration, but commemoration.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if Canadians are talking about celebration, I want to know.
They weren't talking about celebration, no.
Okay.
They were, the Canadian Mennonite article, it draws from a Ben Gosen piece that criticizes celebrating it at all, right? They were this kind of this embarrassment that we're even talking about this right now, okay?
The
So,
MWC was very,
Yeah, yeah.
very, very cautious about framing it as commemoration,
Yeah.
not necessarily celebration.
that's right.
The other one, on the list of renewal that you had, the different kind of elements of renewal, one of the things that I noticed that wasn't on that list was a kind of peace and justice.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder about it, I mean, that element, I would say probably in the latter 20th century, last 50 years, give or take, has been a significant, I would argue, kind of moment of renewal
Yep.
for the Mennonites. And I think in North America, North Atlantic, but also globally as well.
Yeah.
So I'm curious as to why that's not on that list.
Because I didn't want to make that any smaller. Like, it's a very, the font is only like, I make that argument in my book. Like, it is related to the Anabaptist vision. It's that sense of active kind of missionary stuff. But I think you're right. I would 100% agree with that comment. And one of the things one of the things I discovered in the research I did is that the early missionaries, the 19th century missionaries especially, always had care for the body as well as the soul when they went out. Like, some people critique that today. I forget there's a term for it where you give people the soup and then to hear the gospel, to eat the soup they have to hear the gospel first. But there was always a concern about the body, and they set up hospitals and things like that early on. But no, this is just I didn't want to. It's not an exhaustive list, is it in the book? But I would say if you haven't read that far in the book yet, I will make that case later on. So, yes.
I'm trying to think toward the future in ways that you were referring to a little bit ago, and also the borrowing that Mennonites do from other groups or from secular society. And a little kernel of something that I see now interests me in the future. That is Mennonite action. So being an activist in the 60s, anti-war, being at demonstrations, and all of those things, it is very, very different that this organization was formed, that Mennonites come together, Mennonites can sing together outside Senator Warner's office. I don't know where this will go, but I think it's fascinating, and I just was reminded of it. Particularly because I think we are entering what I think everybody has to say, an authoritarian era, where there are many, many issues that people are going to be dealing with. It is very different to have a set of people, and to me it's just astounding. I couldn't believe that when this organization was formed, and there are now maybe 1,000 or so people. So it's small, but it's a very tangible difference to me. And I just wonder if that is something borrowing from the secular society, but doing it in the way and to the extent that feels.
So that's right. So you're taking this practice of secular protest and singing hymns as part of it. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And I think time will tell. Like, that'll be one expression of it. I don't know the longevity of it. I don't know. I mean, yeah. I don't want to speak about Mennonite action because I honestly don't. It's a different, as a Canadian now, speaking about what's in the U.S., I just don't want to speak into something yeah, there's a Canadian Mennonite action. But I will just say that one of the things that is interesting, and this is where I'm saying history doesn't always help us, is that the Anabaptists did a lot better under authoritarian types of rule than democratic types of rule, right? They would find kings or an autocrat in Paraguay or, or a prince or a duke, and they would appeal to them directly for toleration. They would get written a privilege, and they could get there and they could be separate from the law around them. And so democracy and liberalism was a threat to Anabaptists often that they have to adjust to. So I don't, if I was to think about the future, I would say let's have somebody write a Anabaptist proposal for liberal democracy being a good thing. Like, I have not seen that yet, but maybe it is. But historically, there's a lot more, it's easier to be an Anabaptist under an authoritarian. No, unless the authoritarian doesn't like you, and then you have to leave, yeah. Georgia.
Continuing to think about the future, what do you have an inkling or an opinion? I know you're a historian.
You are going against every bone in my body, Georgia, with this.
Do you have just a thought, an inkling about potential for renewal, especially around like digital practices and new technology? What will the renewal theme of this time be beyond peace and justice?
Oh, I don't want to answer that because I'm still a fossil that I like in-person stuff and I like reading physical copies of books. That's a question you could tell me, Georgia, about that. It is, it makes it easier to work. I sometimes attend Mennonite World Conference meetings on higher education, and I can be in a conversation with somebody working with Samia in Central America. So those kinds of things become easier. But I really don't want to answer that question either. So I'm not a prognosticator, but I think there's other things to think about with, I'm just going to leave it at that. Ask me questions about the past.
What's the story you wanted to include that you haven't done?
Oh, good question. I wish I had, let me answer that differently if I could. I wish that my sources for the last 30 years were not press releases, right? There's a lot of stuff that's happening, like the growth of the global church is so new that there hasn't really been enough critical distance yet to analyze it. And so I really, and even what's happening in North America, I don't think that I, as a scholar, had a good understanding. I could not wrap my head around what's going on now. So I relied a lot on press releases, descriptions, and I tried to find quotes from Christians in those contexts. The Global Anabaptist Mennonite series is great, but after I finished the book, of course, 2 good books on the history of Indonesian Anabaptists came out. And it's like, oh, great, perfect. So yeah, I think as those countries develop their own scholars, those histories are going to be really interesting to read. That's a good question, though. Yes?
So this is more reflecting to the last 100 years. As specifically in this community, like Mennonites integrate more into like Harrisburg community or local communities, not just within their own Mennonite communities, how do you think that's going to affect the identity of Anabaptism as they're integrating other cultures? And it's more of a blend rather than inherited Mennonites or
Yeah. I've been here less than 24 hours, so. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that ship has sailed pretty far in North America, with some exceptions, I think. I don't know, Lancaster County might be different where there's a stronger cultural sense to being a Mennonite. That's going to depend on each context. I think taking that ethnic thing away has made it harder to keep the big tent open. I think as people do faith, it gets harder. I'm just going to ramble. I can only speak about my own experience and how that's different than my daughter's, and that my mother is the daughter of a woman who was raised Old Order Amish. So the way so much of that kind of was part of how I was raised, and I don't think that those kinds of cultural practices, or even that kind of, it is really hard for me to toot my own horn, and I do worry about conforming to the world, but I think those kinds of thought patterns aren't as dominant anymore my daughters don't have that at all. They're like totally not that way. So I don't know. Are you taking the class here?
Yeah, I'm in history education.
Okay, yeah, so ask that of your colleagues. It's a great question. I just don't have a good answer for you because it is against my training to do something like that. But no, I can only speculate, and I will do that when the cameras are off. Yeah.
Troy, thank you for writing the book.
Yeah.
I'm really glad for it. I read the book carefully, and I want to applaud you and commend you for something that I found. In the late 1600s, my other ancestor ended up on the Amish side, of the division. And for about 10 generations, my ancestors were Amish. You were very careful to kept reading the book, wondering, okay, when is the academic going to make a note about Jacob Almond and the way, he made a vision? He never did. It was positive throughout. I found.
Okay.
You said at one point the typical North American Anabaptist is an Amish man from like Holmes County.
Yeah. It's the fastest growing Anabaptist group in North America, or the Old Order Amish are the fastest growing Anabaptist group in North America.
We acknowledge that
Yeah.
other side. We talk mostly here about one side of
Yeah.
that mentioned, but there is this other side in the book,
Yeah.
which I want to commend you for including, so that it has a wider readership.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
And I just applaud you for that approach.
Yeah. I mean, I wanted to say that if somebody from those traditions read about themselves in my book, that they could recognize themselves in how I said it. Like, yeah. I did not set out to write a praise book for the whole church, because clearly I didn't. But I appreciate you saying, and it makes me happy to hear you say that, because that's my instinct.